The stories. This hospital wing is a secret trap. Larkin Pruitt learned that phrase from a guard who would not step past the double doors, not even for overtime pay. The wing sat dark on the fourth floor, and people swore it was built to catch the wrong person. He was 34 years old and worked as a biomedical equipment tech at a regional hospital near a river town. That morning, he just wanted to swap old heart monitors, label cables, and go home before his shift ran long. The renovation schedule said the wing was closed, which meant no patients and fewer interruptions for once. The charge nurse handed him a clipboard and pointed at the service elevator with a tired look. "Fourth floor, east wing, and do not get cute with those doors," she said, keeping her voice low. Larkin asked what she meant, and she shook her head like she hated the story. "They lock weird, and that place eats radios," she said, then walked away before he could ask more. Security met him at the elevator with a plastic bin of temporary badges and 2 flashlights. The guard was named Terrence Hale, late 50s, and he moved like his knees hurt every step. Terrence scanned Larkin in, then stopped at the threshold and did not cross it. "If you hear the overhead chime, you walk back out," Terrence said, watching the ceiling instead of Larkin. Larkin tried to laugh, but it came out flat and unsure. He said he was not hunting ghosts, he was swapping monitors and checking batteries. Terrence nodded like he had heard that line too many times before. "Sure," Terrence said, then pointed to the stairwell door behind them. "That is your exit. Remember it." The east wing smelled like old disinfectant and dusty drywall, with a colder air that felt deliberate. Work lights hung from cords, but only 2 of them worked, and they threw long shadows. The hallway signs still named departments that no longer existed, like respiratory overflow and recovery annex. Larkin kept moving, because standing still made the quiet feel heavier than it should. He reached the supply alcove, where the monitors were stacked in a neat row, ready for removal. Each unit had a tag with a date, and the oldest one read 1997 in faded ink. He took out his phone to snap photos for his work log, then noticed his signal was gone. That fit what Terrence said, and it still made Larkin uneasy in a way he could not name. He started on the first monitor and kept his tools close, because he did not like the echo. Metal clicks bounced down the hall, then came back softer, like someone else was repeating them. He told himself it was just the building, just the empty rooms and the tile floors. Then the overhead speaker crackled, and a single tone chirped like a call bell clearing its throat. The sound lasted 2 seconds, then the speaker went quiet again. Larkin froze with a screwdriver in his hand, listening hard for anything that followed. Nothing happened, so he exhaled and forced himself to keep working. That was when the double doors behind him swung inward and shut with a heavy final thud. He turned and walked back fast, because he did not like the timing at all. The doors had no handle on his side, just a smooth plate and a narrow seam. He pushed anyway and felt the panel give a little, then lock solid like it hit a deadbolt. He called out Terrence's name, but his voice died in the hallway like the air swallowed it. Larkin stepped back and tried the crash bar on the nearby stairwell door. The bar did not move, and the red alarm light above it did not blink. He pulled his badge and waved it at the reader, and the reader stayed dark. That was the moment the phrase made sense, and his stomach tightened with a cold rush. He walked to the closest nurse station and found an old desk with a dead computer monitor. A dusty phone sat on the counter, and its receiver cord was cut cleanly. On the wall behind it, a laminated map showed routes marked with arrows and thick lines. Someone had written in pen across the bottom, "Do not use east exit during isolation." Larkin had heard stories about isolation wings during outbreaks, but this felt older than that. He followed the map, moving slow and checking each intersection for an open stairwell. Every door he tried was locked, and the badge readers were either blank or missing. The only thing that worked was the overhead speaker, which clicked again and gave one more chirp. He stopped near room 418 because the door was cracked open a few inches. Inside was a stripped patient room with an empty bed frame and a cracked plastic chair. The window blinds were half down, and the light from outside made the room look underwater. On the floor near the wall, a thin line of dust was disturbed, like something had been dragged recently. Larkin crouched and looked closer, and he saw scuff marks leading to the bathroom. The bathroom door was closed, but the handle was intact and it opened with a soft squeal. There was nothing inside except an old vent grate and a faint smell of damp drywall. Then he noticed the grate screws were new, shiny against the rust around them. He could have ignored it, but his instincts would not let him. He grabbed the grate and pulled, and it popped free like someone wanted it removed fast. Behind it was a narrow space, not a normal duct, more like a hidden passage between walls. A second vent cover sat a few feet in, and beyond that, he saw a faint glow. Larkin took out his flashlight and aimed it into the gap, then heard a low whir of a fan. The glow came from a small work light set on the floor, and it was still warm. Someone had been there, and not a long time ago. His skin prickled and he backed away, because he did not have any business crawling into a wall. He returned to the hallway and tried to call again, but his phone still showed no service. He turned on airplane mode and off again, then tried anyway, and it failed like before. He opened his work bag and found a small handheld tester with a recording function for troubleshooting. It was not meant for this, but it was better than nothing. So he pressed record and spoke clearly. He said his name, his job, the date, and that he was locked inside the East Wing. He described the speaker tones, the door shut, and the vent gap with a warm light inside. He did it the way he filed incident reports, calm and factual, even though his hands shook. When he finished, he clipped the tester to his belt like a tiny witness. Larkin walked back to the double doors and pounded 3 times, then waited. No footsteps came, no reply, and the air felt colder near the doors, like the building was breathing. He looked up and saw a small camera dome in the corner, its lens facing down the hall. The tiny green light on it was off, which meant it might not be recording at all. He remembered the map and the note about isolation, and he started thinking like a tech again. If this wing was built for quarantine, it could have negative pressure, sealed doors, and remote locks. That could explain the weird air and the dead signals if the walls were reinforced. It could also explain why Terrence would not cross the threshold, because nobody wanted to be locked inside. He needed a control panel, something that ran the doors and the fans. He followed the hall until he found a metal door marked with faded letters, "Facilities only." It was locked, but the hinge side had a gap where the frame did not meet right. He slid his flashlight beam along it and saw the corner of a keypad inside. He tried the door again and felt it flex, like the latch was old and tired. He took a flat tool from his kit and worked it into the gap carefully, pushing in small increments. After a minute, the latch slipped, and the door opened with a groan that echoed too far. Inside was a cramped room full of conduit, breaker boxes, and a panel with tiny labeled switches. The panel had a sticker that read, "Isolation System, installed 1999. Below it sat a thin binder in a cracked plastic sleeve, full of maintenance notes. Larkin flipped through and saw repeated entries about door faults, speaker tests, and lock cycling. One note was underlined twice and dated 2008, and it said, "Do not enable autoseal without supervisor." He kept turning pages and found an incident entry that made him stop breathing for a second. It said a contractor got trapped after a test, and dispatch logs showed a delayed response. The note used careful language, but it ended with, "Injury reported, claim filed." Larkin had never heard about any of that, and he worked here for years. He pulled out his phone and took photos of the binder pages, then remembered there was no service. He took them anyway, because proof mattered later, even if he could not send it now. He scanned the panel and found a switch labeled Seal Enable, and it was in the on position. Next to it was a smaller switch labeled Override Release, and it was covered with a taped plastic guard. The tape looked fresh, and the guard had tiny scratches like it had been forced back recently. Larkin peeled the tape carefully and lifted the guard, then flipped the override release down. A low alarm tone sounded, not loud, but sharp, and the fans slowed like they were winding down. Down the hall, he heard the double doors clunk like bolts retracting inside the frame. He ran back to the threshold and pushed, and this time the doors moved with stiff resistance. They opened just enough for him to squeeze through, and cool normal air hit his face. He did not feel relief yet, because the hallway behind him was still dark and still wrong. He stepped out fully, and the doors shut again behind him with a softer close. Terrence was gone from the security desk, and the service elevator stood open and empty. Larkin jogged to the main corridor and finally saw a nurse, then another, then a doctor. He waved them down and tried to explain, but his voice came out too fast. A supervisor told him to sit, drink water, and wait for security, and Larkin did not argue. Within minutes, a different guard arrived, younger, and his radio worked fine in the main hall. Larkin told him everything, and he handed over the recording from the tester without hesitation. He also showed the photos on his phone, even though they were just images in a dead zone. The guard frowned and said the East Wing should be sealed only during drills, and nobody scheduled any drills. Later that afternoon, the hospital risk manager pulled Larkin into a small conference room. She was named Maris Holt, early 40s, and she spoke like someone used to bad news. She asked him to repeat the timeline, then asked if he touched anything inside the wing. Larkin said he opened a facility's door and flipped an override, because he was trapped and had no other choice. Maris stared for a long moment, then nodded slowly like she had expected that answer. She said the isolation system was supposed to be decommissioned years ago, but the project never finished. She did not explain why, and she did not have to, because her eyes gave it away. Some parts of the hospital were left behind on paper, but still alive in the walls. The next day, Larkin came back with permission to gather his tools and finish his work. This time, 2 guards went with him, and one of them carried a portable repeater for radio signal. They logged every door, every switch, and every camera dome they could find. The repeater worked until they crossed the threshold. Then the signal died again like it hit a curtain. They followed Larkin to the facilities room, and the seal enable switch was on again. Maris was not there, but a facilities supervisor was, and his face went tight when he saw it. He said nobody on his team touched that panel, and he sounded scared saying it. The younger guard took photos and called for a detective from the city, because now it was not a glitch. The detective arrived with a notebook and a calm voice, and she asked for every record they had. She requested keycard logs for the service elevator, maintenance entries, and any camera footage near the 4th floor. She used careful phrases like reportedly and consistent with, as if she knew the hospital would fight itself. Larkin watched her write, and he felt a sick pride that his recording might matter. The keycard logs showed an odd detail. One badge had accessed the service elevator at dawn that day. The badge belonged to a contract cleaner, but witness statements said the cleaner never showed up. The hospital said badges were sometimes shared, which was a problem all by itself. The detective asked who had custody of spare badges, and security went quiet. They pulled older records too, because the binder note about 2008 would not leave Larkin's mind. Dispatch logs from that year showed a call from the East Wing, then a second call, then a response delay. The narrative report used soft language about confusion and locked doors, but the pattern felt familiar. Maris admitted the injury claim existed, and she said it was settled quietly to avoid panic. Then the detective found something that connected the vent gap to the locks in a way nobody liked. A building plan from archived facilities files showed a service crawl behind room 418. It linked to a small corridor that led toward the pharmacy level, not wide enough for comfort. The plan labeled it as a contamination bypass, built so supplies could move during isolation. On paper, it made sense, but the fresh screws and warm work light meant it was being used now. They sent a small camera probe into the gap, and its final footage showed drag marks and boot prints. Near the far end, the camera caught a plastic tote wedged behind a pipe, still sealed. Inside the tote were dozens of pre-packed syringe kits, the kind tracked tightly by the pharmacy. That discovery changed the tone of the whole investigation, because now there was a motive. Someone was using the old bypass to steal controlled supplies without crossing monitored hallways. The lock trap was not superstition. It was a tool, and it kept witnesses out of the way. If a tech got stuck inside, the thief could work the bypass with less risk of being seen. The twist came when they matched the Dawn badge swipe to a second system log. The isolation panel recorded every time the seal enable switch changed position. It showed the switch was turned on 2 minutes after the badge swipe, then turned off later. That meant the person who entered wanted the wing sealed, and they knew exactly where the panel was. They checked cameras outside the threshold because those still worked, and one angle finally gave a face. The figure wore scrubs under a jacket and kept their head down, but the gait was distinct. A nurse manager recognized the walk and the shoes, and she said it matched a long-time supply runner. The hospital could not accuse anyone publicly, but the detective did not need public accusations. A week later, the detective returned with a warrant and took a specific employee into custody off-site. The public statement said an internal theft ring was under investigation, and details were limited. Mara sent a short email to staff saying the East Wing was sealed permanently pending safety upgrades. No one wrote the words "secret trap" in that email, but everybody understood the message anyway. Larkin finished replacing the monitors in a different unit, and he refused any job that required the East Wing. He kept the tester recording backed up at home because he did not trust systems that went dark. Sometimes he still thought about that chirp from the overhead speaker, small and polite and wrong. It sounded like a warning or a signal, and he believed it had saved him by making him move. Months later, after the panel was removed and the bypass was filled, Terrence finally told Larkin one more thing. He said the wing was built to protect the rest of the hospital, and it did when used right. He said the danger came when someone decided protection could also be a cage. Larkin nodded and looked at the plain wall where the double doors used to be, and felt quiet relief. The stories. Never ignore calls from a ranger station. The warning was printed on the county dispatch poster after the incident at the North Ridge Ranger Station. It was not a slogan, it was a reminder, written like a bruise. In late September of 2019, Tamsin Crow was 34 and worked as a county radio technician. She drove service routes between towers, repeaters, and the kind of buildings people forgot existed. That morning, she had one simple goal: swap a failing battery bank before the weekend storm arrived. The request looked routine: a maintenance ticket with a ranger station phone number attached. The station sat near a long stretch of forest road in a western state that gets windy in fall. It was not remote like a postcard, but it was far enough that help came slowly. Tamsin packed tools, a spare handset, and a digital recorder she used for interference complaints. She also brought a printed map, because cell service vanished on the last ridge. About 20 minutes from the station, her work phone rang with a number she did not recognize. The caller ID still labeled it as the Ranger Station, which made her lift it quickly. A man spoke in a flat tone, and his words sounded like they were being read. "Do not come here alone. Do not call the sheriff. Bring the radio keys." Tamsin asked who he was, and the line went silent except for a soft clicking sound. It was not wind. It was rhythmic, like a relay switching on and off somewhere nearby. She said she could call the ranger on duty, and the man whispered one more sentence. "Tell dispatch the blue folder is not theirs." Then hang up. The call ended, and her phone showed full bars for a moment before dropping to none. Tamsin pulled over, took a breath, and wrote down the exact wording in her notebook. She tried to call back, but the phone acted like the number did not exist. That was the first time she considered turning around, and she did not yet. She reached the ranger station a little after 10, and the parking lot was empty. The building looked normal, a low office with a covered porch and a faded mapboard. A sign on the door said, "Closed for training." But the chain was not latched. Tamsin knocked anyway, then waited long enough to hear her own tires ticking. When nobody answered, she walked around to the side where the utility cabinet sat. The cabinet held a backup radio console and a line to the nearest repeater tower. The padlock had been cut cleanly, and the broken shackle lay in the gravel. Tamsin did not touch it, and she backed away as if it might still be hot. She returned to her truck and called county dispatch on the two-way, not the phone. Dispatch answered quickly, and Tamsin kept her voice steady while giving her unit number. She said she had arrived for maintenance, and she had received a strange warning call. She repeated the line about the blue folder, and the dispatcher paused before replying. The dispatcher asked her to say it again, and Tamsin did. Slower this time. A second voice came on, reportedly a supervisor who handled after-hours ranger contacts. He asked if the caller mentioned radio keys, and she confirmed that detail quietly. Then he told her to stay in her vehicle and not to enter the building. Tamsin watched the front door, and she saw a dim shape pass behind the glass. It was not a clear silhouette, more like a shadow crossing a hallway light. She keyed the mic and told dispatch what she saw, and her hands shook once. Dispatch said units were en route, and the supervisor told her to keep recording. Tamsin turned on her digital recorder and set it on the dashboard near the speaker. She kept the truck idling, and she angled the mirror to watch the porch. A minute later, the station phone rang again, and this time the sound carried outside. It rang from inside the building, muffled and lonely, then stopped, then rang again. Tamsin did not answer her work phone when it lit up, even though instinct begged her. Instead, she recorded the ringtone pattern because it sounded slightly warped, like tape drag. Dispatch asked if she could read the number on the caller ID, and she tried. It displayed the ranger station number again, as if the station were calling itself. A deputy arrived first, then a second unit, and they parked behind her truck. They kept their lights off, and they approached on foot with hands near their belts. Tamsin stepped out only when told, and she handed her recorder to the deputy sergeant. She explained the cut lock, the shadow, and the message about the blue folder. The deputies checked the front door and called out, but nobody answered from inside. They entered with caution, and Tamsin stayed outside near the trucks with dispatch on radio. Through the open door, she could hear boots on tile and a distant phone ringing again. A deputy called for a ranger by name, then asked for a key holder, then swore softly. The sergeant came back out and told Tamsin to wait, but his face had changed. He said the building looked staged, and he did not mean messy or ransacked. He meant chairs were placed wrong, files were open on a desk, and radios were unplugged. He also said the station logbook had been removed, along with a blue folder. The mention of the blue folder made Tamsin feel cold, even in the sun. She asked what the folder was, and the sergeant did not answer right away. He said it might be nothing, then added that it was nothing he wanted to guess. Then he asked if she could help them understand the phone and radio setup. Tamsin walked them to the side cabinet and pointed out the cut padlock. She explained what the cabinet powered and how the backup console could patch calls. The sergeant asked if a person inside could spoof the station number on outgoing calls. Tamsin said it was possible, but it would require access to the line interface. She opened her notebook and showed the message, written exactly as she heard it. The sergeant read it twice, then asked why someone would say not to call the sheriff. Tamsin said the voice sounded trained, like a script, not like panic or a prank. Dispatch came over the radio and said they had pulled archived calls from the station. According to dispatch logs, the station phone had called 911 twice that morning. Both calls were open line, with faint clicking noises and no spoken words. The calls came from the station number, and the location pinged correctly on their system. It meant someone used the station line, or someone made it look that way. A ranger supervisor arrived next, a woman named Marlo Penn, 41, district manager. She greeted the deputies with tight shoulders, then asked Tamsin to repeat everything. Tamsin did, and Marlo listened like she had heard pieces of it before. Marlo asked for the recorder back, and she promised it would be logged as evidence. Marlo also said 2 rangers were supposed to be on duty for training, but nobody checked in. She did not give names, and she kept details vague, like she was protecting staff. The deputies asked if there were any internal investigations, and she said, not officially. Then she said there were rumors, and rumors were why she drove out so fast. Inside the building, the deputies found a desk phone off the hook on the floor. They found the backup radio console open and a jumper wire tied into the patch port. Tamsin recognized the setup because it could route a radio transmission into the phone line. It could also route a phone audio feed into the radio if someone knew the settings. That detail changed the whole feeling of the day because it meant the warning call mattered. It also meant the clicking sound might be a relay toggling the patch on and off. Tamsin told Marlo that, and Marlo looked at the cabinet like it was a trap. Marlo asked if someone could broadcast using the station number as cover, and Tamsin nodded. By early afternoon, the search widened to the nearby trails and the storage shed behind the station. A K-9 team arrived and worked the porch, the hallway, and the back lot. Witness statements later said the dog alerted near a locked closet in the rear office. The closet was open when they forced it, and it held only a mop bucket and a clean shelf. But the wall behind the shelf sounded hollow, and a deputy noticed new screws in the trim. They removed the trim and found a narrow access panel hidden like a cheap stage trick. Behind it was a crawl space with a metal file box pushed deep into the dark. The box held cassette tapes, dispatch printouts, and a single blue folder with no label. Tamsin stood outside while they brought it out, and she watched faces tighten again. The tapes were old, and several were marked with months from 2016. A deputy said the folder contained copies of incident reports that were never filed properly. Some pages looked like drafts, with missing signatures and handwritten notes in the margins. One note said, "Do not send to county. Handle internally until winter." Marlowe took one look and asked for a formal chain of custody, and the sergeant agreed. She said the folder was supposed to be locked in the district safe, not in a wall. She also said the station had been used for unofficial debriefs after certain rescues. According to her, some calls were sensitive, and she regretted how that culture formed. That was when the twist started to take shape, not as a movie shock, but as a pattern. The missing Rangers were not missing in the wilderness. They were missing from the schedule. Their names were not on the public roster that week, and the training sign was a lie. The station had been used as a private listening post where recordings could be reviewed. Tamsin asked why anyone would hide that, and Marlowe gave a careful answer. She said there had been a whistleblower complaint months earlier, and people got scared. If the county took control of the station comms, certain mistakes would become permanent record. So someone tried to control the record, and controlling the record meant controlling the phones. The warning call to Tamsin now made a different kind of sense, and it was worse. Someone wanted the blue folder protected, but also wanted the patch setup discovered safely. They did not trust the sheriff, or they did not trust certain deputies, or both. So they called the one person who understood radios and who was not part of either side. Dispatch later confirmed something else from their archives, and it was the key detail. During the open line 911 calls, a faint voice was barely audible under the clicking. It sounded like a person trying to speak while someone else held a hand over their mouth. The words were not clear, but one phrase appeared in multiple transcript attempts. "Not the safe. Not the safe." Marlowe heard that and went pale, because the district safe had been opened that morning. The safe was located at a different office, miles away, and only two people had access. One was Marlowe, and the other was a senior ranger who had called in sick. Marlowe said she never opened it, and she offered her keys to the sergeant without hesitation. A search warrant followed, and what investigators reportedly found was not dramatic, just damning. The safe held empty folders where the blue folder should have been. A log showed it was accessed the previous night, after hours, with a code entry recorded. The code was used correctly, which meant the person knew it or forced someone to type it. The senior ranger returned to work days later with a lawyer, and he said nothing useful. No charges were publicly announced connected to that specific day, at least not at the time. But internal discipline followed, and several staff were reassigned quietly over the next months. Marlowe kept her job, but she was moved to a role with less direct control. For Tamsin, the last piece came from her own recorder, which she finally got back. She listened to the first warning call again, and she noticed a soft second voice. It was so low that it sounded like air on the line, unless she wore good headphones. The second voice said one word, right after, "Bring the radio keys." It said, "Please." That was the part that bothered her most, because it sounded human and scared. It did not sound like a plot. It sounded like a person trapped in a bad decision. Tamsin gave the clip to the detective assigned to the case, and it went into evidence. After that, she was told not to discuss it, and she kept that promise. Years later, the station reopened with new locks, new policies, and a new phone system. The poster at dispatch stayed up because it did not blame anyone by name. It simply said, "Never ignore calls from a ranger station," because sometimes the call is not a request. Sometimes it is the only safe way someone can say that something is terribly wrong. The stories. The unsettling truth about this church basement. The first dispatch note called it a welfare check, but the basement door was bolted from the outside. By dawn, the church had taped off its own hallway, and nobody could agree on what they heard. In a river town in the upper Midwest, the old brick church sat one block from the courthouse. It was the kind of place that hosted potlucks, weddings, and quiet funerals all year. On a humid Tuesday in late summer, a man named Teague Ralston showed up early. Teague was 36, and he worked as a municipal building inspector for the county. He planned to finish one routine inspection, then grab coffee before his afternoon meetings. The church had applied for a permit to replace a stair rail near the basement steps. Teague had signed off on similar work dozens of times, and he expected nothing unusual. The pastor met him at the side entrance, smiling like this was an easy win. Her name was MrBallen, and she looked tired under her neat hair. She apologized for the smell of paint, then said the contractor was running late. Teague asked for the basement access, since that was where the steps started. Maris led him down a narrow hallway, past a bulletin board and a locked office door. At the end, a heavy metal door sat under a faded exit sign. Maris reached for her keyring, then stopped and frowned at the latch. The padlock was already on, and it was snapped shut. Maris said, "That's not ours. We don't lock it like that." Teague leaned close and saw a fresh scratch in the metal near the staple. It looked like someone had forced the lock into place with a tool. He asked who had a key, and Maris shook her head too quickly. Teague didn't like surprises, especially around fire egress and public spaces. He told Maris he needed the lock removed, and he would note it in his report. Maris tried to laugh, then said, "Maybe the contractor did it for safety." Teague asked for the contractor's name, and she gave a company he recognized. He called the number from his phone, and it went to a generic voicemail prompt. A muffled thump came from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a knee hitting a wall. Maris went still, then whispered, "Did you hear that?" Teague put his ear near the seam, and he heard a faint dragging sound. It lasted only a second, then there was silence again. Teague stepped back and asked if anyone was down there. Maris said the basement was empty, and her voice sounded practiced. Teague tried the handle anyway, and it didn't budge. He told Maris he was calling it in because a locked basement wasn't normal. Maris lifted her hands, then said, "Please, don't make a scene." Teague called the non-emergency line for the police department. He kept his voice calm, and he described the lock and the noise. The dispatcher asked if he saw smoke or immediate danger, and he said no. Then the dispatcher asked if anyone was missing, and Teague hesitated. Maris answered that nobody was missing, but she sounded irritated. The dispatcher said an officer would come by when available. Teague didn't love that, so he tried the door again, harder this time. The metal rattled, and the padlock held. Another thump came from inside, followed by what sounded like a quick breath. Teague looked at Maris, and she stared at the floor tiles. He told her he was going to step outside and find a tool. Maris said, "You can't break church property." Teague said, "Someone might be trapped. I'm not waiting." He walked out to his truck, grabbed a small bolt cutter, and headed back inside. He carried it like it was just another piece of work gear. Maris followed him, and her shoes squeaked on the tile. She said the church had an old fallout shelter room down there. Nothing more. Teague asked why a fallout room would need a fresh padlock. Maris said, "It's complicated. We just need time." Teague didn't answer because his focus had narrowed to the lock. He knelt, set the cutter jaws, and squeezed. The lock resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack. The door swung inward an inch, as if pressure had been holding it closed. A breath of air spilled out, sour and damp, like wet cardboard and old bleach. Teague pulled the door open and stepped into the stairwell. The light switch didn't work, so he used his phone flashlight. The steps were steep, and the handrail was new, still sticky with paint. Halfway down, he saw scuff marks on the wall, like heels had kicked during a struggle. At the bottom, the basement opened into a wide room with folding tables stacked neatly. Teague called out again, and his voice echoed off concrete. A soft whimper answered from behind a partition wall near the furnace room. He moved slowly, keeping his light low, and he saw a figure crouched by a pipe. It was a young man, late teens maybe, with wrists red and raw. Duct tape lay on the floor beside him, torn and dirty. The young man flinched when the light hit his face. He raised his hands and said, "Don't close it. Please don't close it." Teague said, "It's open. You're okay. What's your name?" The young man swallowed and said, "Kellen. Kellen Drex." His voice was hoarse, like he had been shouting for hours. Teague asked if anyone else was down there. Kellen shook his head, then pointed toward a storage closet. He said, "They moved the stuff," they said, "to keep quiet." Teague asked who, and Kellen's eyes darted upward toward the stairs. He said, "Church people. Not all, just some." Teague told him he was calling police again, and he did it immediately. This time, he said there was a restrained person in the basement. The dispatcher's tone changed, and she said officers were on the way. Teague stayed between Kellen and the stairs, watching the doorway like it might bite. Maris appeared at the top step. framed by the hallway light. She looked down and froze when she saw Kellen. Her face went pale, then her jaw tightened like she was forcing herself to breathe. She started down one step, then stopped, gripping the rail. Teague said, "Don't come closer, just wait upstairs." Maris said, "Kellen, what are you doing here?" Kellen didn't answer, and his shoulders shook with contained sobs. Teague watched Maris's hands, because they were trembling. She said, "This isn't what it looks like." Teague said, "It looks like someone locked him in." Maris backed up without another word. Teague heard her shoes retreat, then a door slam somewhere above. For a moment, the basement felt even colder, despite the humid air. Kellen whispered, "She's not the worst one." Teague asked who was, and Kellen stared at the concrete. 2 officers arrived within minutes, according to later timestamps in the logs. They came down cautiously, hands near their belts, lights sweeping the corners. Teague explained what happened, and Kellen repeated his name and age. He said he was 19, and he had come to talk to someone at the church. He claimed he had been in a counseling session, then told to wait downstairs. Kellen said he asked to leave, and someone blocked the stairs. He said there were voices, then tape, then the click of a lock. He couldn't name everyone, but he described one man with a heavy ring. He remembered the ring because it scratched his cheek when tape was pressed down. He also remembered a sweet chemical smell, like a cleaner or solvent. The officers took Kellen upstairs and sat him on a chair in the fellowship hall. They asked Teague to stay. Since he was a witness and the one who cut the lock, Teague sat at a table with a paper cup of water, hands still buzzing. A third officer walked through the building, checking rooms and doors. The basement door was now open, and a strip of tape marked it as a scene. Maris finally returned, with another person close behind her. It was a man in a suit jacket, older, broad-shouldered, and polished-looking. He introduced himself as the church administrator, Hollis Quaid. He asked why police were in his building, and his tone was offended. One officer said there was a report of unlawful restraint, and Hollis smiled tightly. Hollis said, "This is a misunderstanding. The young man is unstable." Kellen looked up at that, and his mouth opened in disbelief. He said, "I asked to leave? You told them to lock it." Hollis raised a hand and said, "Son, you were a danger to yourself." Kellen shook his head, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Teague watched Hollis, and he noticed something small. On Hollis's right hand, a thick ring glinted under the hall lights. It was silver, with a dark stone that looked almost black. Teague remembered Kellen's detail, and his stomach tightened again. He told the officer quietly about the ring description and the scratch detail. The officers asked Hollis to step aside, and they requested keys and records. Hollis said the church kept counseling notes confidential, protected by policy. The officer said policy wasn't the same as law, and he asked again. Maris stood behind Hollis, eyes on the floor, hands clasped so hard her knuckles whitened. The air in the room felt thin, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Kellen asked for his phone, and he said it was taken from him. He said his backpack was in the basement storage closet. An officer went down with Teague and retrieved it, carefully, like evidence. Inside the backpack was a notebook with scribbled dates and names. There was also a small digital voice recorder, the kind used for lectures. Kellen said he carried it because he forgot things when he got anxious. He said he recorded meetings sometimes so he could replay them later. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them asked if he recorded today. Kellen nodded and said, "I think it's still running." Teague felt a cold flush, because that meant everything might be on tape. The recorder was still on, and its red light blinked weakly. The officer stopped it, bagged it, and noted the time. They didn't play it there, but later reports referenced a partial audio file. It reportedly captured voices arguing about liability, reputation, and keeping things contained. It also reportedly captured a sentence about the lock, spoken like an instruction. Teague didn't hear the audio himself, not that day. What he saw was the way Hollis's confidence cracked when the recorder appeared. His smile faded, and his eyes went sharp, like a cornered animal. He asked who was allowed to record, and an officer told him to stay quiet. Maris's face looked like it might fold in half, and she pressed a palm to her mouth. Kellen also had photos on his phone, which officers later recovered from the basement. He had snapped pictures of a hallway bulletin board before the session started. The photos showed a calendar with handwritten blocks and initials beside time slots. There were also sticky notes with room numbers, and one said basement. Another said lock check with a date written for that morning. Teague asked how Kellen took photos if his phone was taken. Kellen said he took them earlier when nobody was watching, then hid the phone briefly. He said someone found it later, after he asked to leave. That detail sounded messy, but it also sounded like the truth. The photos had timestamps that fit the sequence, according to the officer's comment. By late afternoon, investigators from the county arrived. They took statements, photographed the lock, and measured the scuff marks on the wall. They also photographed the new handrail and the paint that smeared near the scratches. A technician swabbed the tape scraps for residue and fingerprints. Teague watched from the side, trying to make his breathing slow and steady. Kellen was taken to a clinic for evaluation, mostly for dehydration and stress. A nurse later noted bruising consistent with restraint, according to a summary Teague heard. The clinic also documented abrasions on his wrists and cheek. None of it proved motive, but it supported Kellen's story. Teague sat in his truck afterward, hands on the wheel, not turning the key. He went back to his office and filed his inspection report anyway. He noted the padlocked egress door, the broken lock, and the potential hazard. He attached photos he took after police arrived, keeping them factual and clean. He also wrote a separate memo for his supervisor, because this felt bigger. His supervisor told him to forward everything to the county attorney's office. Over the next week, rumors spread through town faster than any official update. People argued at diners, in parking lots, and on church steps after Sunday service. Some said Kellen was trespassing. Others said the church was hiding something. Teague tried to keep his head down, but he kept getting calls. A local reporter left voicemails asking for comment, and he never answered. Then, a new detail surfaced, and it shifted the whole story. A retired maintenance worker came forward after seeing the news segment. He said the basement door had been altered years earlier. He said the church once had a crash bar on the inside, but it was removed. He said he complained, and he was told it was temporary during renovations. The maintenance worker provided an old photo, taken during a volunteer workday. It showed the same door, but with the crash bar still installed. In the background, a whiteboard listed tasks, and one line said, "Remove bar." The date on the whiteboard was written in thick marker, 2012. Teague stared at the photo in disbelief, because it matched what he saw now. That meant the basement exit had been made easier to trap from the outside. Teague realized the padlock was not an accident or a one-time panic. It looked more like a system, slowly built to be invisible. A door that should always open had been turned into a cage. The unsettling truth wasn't only what happened to Kellen, it was how ready the building was. Investigators requested records related to renovations and safety inspections. They also subpoenaed emails from the church's administrative accounts. According to later summaries, certain messages referenced discretion and risk management. There were also references to a room used for difficult conversations. Nobody wrote the word basement as a confession, but the hints lined up. Teague was asked to come in for a follow-up interview. He described the lock, the noises, Maris's reaction, and Hollis's ring. He also mentioned the smell of cleaner, since Kellen remembered it too. An investigator told him they found a jug of industrial solvent downstairs. It was used for stripping floors, but it also made tape stick better for a while. Weeks later, the county released a statement that charges were being considered. They didn't name suspects in public, but they confirmed a continuing inquiry. The church suspended counseling sessions and closed the basement to the public. Hollis resigned, citing health reasons, and Maris took a leave of absence. None of that felt like closure. It felt like a curtain drawn quickly. Teague kept thinking about the moment the lock snapped. He had expected an empty room and a minor code violation. Instead, he found a person waiting in the dark, trying not to panic. He wondered how many others had sat down there and stayed quiet. He wondered how many people believed it was for their own good. Kellen eventually moved away, according to a neighbor who spoke to Teague later. He didn't want to be known as the basement kid for the rest of his life. Teague respected that, and he never tried to contact him again. He kept his role small, just a witness who did his job. Still, the sound of that thump behind the door stayed with him. On certain mornings, Teague drove past the church on his way to inspections. The building looked the same from the street, steady and respectable. Sunlight hit the stained glass, and cars lined the curb for community events. But Teague knew what could be hidden behind a quiet hallway. He learned that safety wasn't only codes and rails, it was who held the keys. The stories. This tape explains the warning signs. The tape was logged into evidence on a Tuesday, and the label only said, "Warning signs, do not ignore." When people finally listened to it, a year of roadside deaths stopped looking random and started looking engineered. In late 2019, Dax Calder was 37 and worked as a county sign technician for Public Works. He spent most days replacing faded reflectors, straightening bent posts, and arguing with weathered bolts. That morning, he had one simple goal: confirm the new warning signs on a mountain bypass were correct. The bypass cut through pine forest and rocky slopes about 20 miles from a small river town. It was the kind of road locals used to avoid traffic, and tourists used when their GPS got stubborn. For months, there had been crash reports near mile marker 12, mostly at night and in clear weather. Dispatch logs described drivers swearing they followed the signs, right up until the road turned wrong. Dax parked his county truck by a gravel pull-off, then walked the shoulder with a clipboard. He counted chevrons, measured sign height, and checked that each post was seated firmly in packed dirt. Everything looked normal at first, and that bothered him more than anything strange ever could. If the road was dangerous, it should look dangerous, and it did not. The first warning sign was a standard yellow curve sign with an advisory speed. It was fresh, reflective, and aimed straight at the lane like it had been installed yesterday. Dax wrote down its placement, then stood behind it to check the bolts in the bracket. That was when he saw the backplate had a second set of holes, drilled clean and recent. He touched the metal and felt a faint grit, like someone had ground it and wiped it fast. County signs came from a warehouse, and nobody was supposed to drill new holes in the field. Dax took photos anyway, then noted the serial number stamped near the lower edge. The serial number did not match the shipment list he printed that morning. He drove farther and found the next sign, a narrow bridge warning near a shallow ravine. The bridge was not narrow, and the guardrails were modern and well-maintained. Dax checked his map and confirmed there was no bridge project scheduled for this road. He stared at the sign until his eyes started hunting for an explanation that was not there. A pickup came up behind him, slow and cautious, then stopped in the lane with hazards flashing. The driver rolled down the window and asked if the road was closed because the signs looked wrong. Dax said the road was open, and he asked what signs the driver had seen. The driver said, 2 detour arrows and a warning about a drop-off, and none of it made sense. Dax felt a tight heat in his chest because his clipboard showed no detour signs at all. He asked where the driver saw them, and the driver pointed back toward a turn he had already passed. Dax thanked him, then watched the pickup crawl away like the driver did not trust the pavement. When the truck disappeared, Dax walked to his county rig and called his supervisor. His supervisor was Renly Goss, early 50s, a practical manager who hated surprises. Renly answered on the second ring and sounded annoyed until Dax said, "Wrong signs," and "new drill holes." Renly told him to pull the signs if he could, and to document everything before touching anything. Dax agreed, then drove back toward the turn the pickup driver mentioned. The detour arrows were there, but they were not county issue, and they were not on proper posts. They were strapped to trees with metal banding angled to pull drivers toward a dirt service road. The service road dropped downhill into dense brush, then curved behind a ridge and disappeared. A small hand-painted board read "Bridge Out," and the letters looked fresh. Dax stood at the edge and watched a sedan approach, headlights bright in late afternoon shade. The driver slowed, saw the detour, and started to turn onto the service road without hesitation. Dax stepped into view and waved both arms, forcing the driver to stop hard. The driver rolled down the window and said, "The signs told me to go this way." Dax told the driver to stay on the paved bypass because the detour was not official. The driver looked embarrassed, then angry, and asked why the signs were there at all. Dax did not have an answer he could prove, so he said they were unauthorized and dangerous. The driver backed out carefully and left, and Dax felt his hands trembling afterward. He took photos of every arrow, every strap, and every bolt head. He also noticed something else. Each detour sign was placed just before a blind curve. Drivers had only a second to decide, and the detour looked like the safe choice. Dax recorded voice notes on his phone, then tried to send them, and the upload stalled. The bypass had patchy coverage, so he saved everything and drove to higher ground. From a ridge turnout, he finally got enough signal to send Renly a batch of photos. Renly called back immediately and told him to stop touching anything and wait for law enforcement. Dax said he would, but he did not like leaving the signs up even for an hour. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, a lean woman named Tressa Mullaney, mid-30s. She listened, took her own photos, and called it in with a tone that turned serious fast. Tressa asked if Dax had seen anyone nearby, and Dax said only one pickup passing earlier. She nodded and said that matched witness statements from past crash calls. They removed the tree-strapped signs and loaded them into the deputy SUV. Under the painted board, they found a strip of reflective tape like a road crew used. Tressa said the county did not use that exact tape, and she sounded certain about it. Dax asked if this was connected to the crashes, and she said, "It looks like it could be." Renly told Dax to return to the yard and pull old installation records for the bypass. Dax spent the evening in a dusty office, flipping binders and scanning sign serial numbers. He found that 2 shipments had gone missing over the past year, both marked as minor losses. The lost notes said damaged in transit, which now felt like a lazy answer. The next day, Tressa met Dax in a small interview room at the sheriff office. She played him a clip from an archived 911 call from 2018. A shaken driver described a bridge-out sign and a detour that led into darkness. The driver said he turned back in time, and he kept repeating that the signs looked official. Tressa also had crash scene photos from 2018 and 2019. In each case, responders found tire tracks on the same service road leading to the ravine. Some vehicles rolled, some hit trees, and one went far enough that it was hard to locate. The official reports blamed driver error because no one could confirm the signs. Dax stared at the photos and realized why the signs were never in evidence. The signs did not stay up long, and nobody thought to collect them until too late. Tressa said a volunteer firefighter once mentioned hearing a power tool at night. The firefighter never reported it because the sound faded and nothing seemed wrong then. Now that detail mattered, and the deputy wrote it down with a grim look. Dax tried to think like a technician, not like a person getting spooked. He made a map of where the fake signs had been placed, using his photos and GPS stamps. A pattern showed up fast. Each cluster was near a spot where a vehicle could not easily turn around. If a driver committed to the detour, they were trapped by narrow cuts and loose gravel. Tressa asked if county staff could have installed them, even by accident. Dax said county crews would not strap signs to trees with banding because it broke policy. He also said the drilled sign backs meant someone had access to real county panels. That did not prove anything alone, but it narrowed the pool of people who could do it. Renly gave Dax a copy of the warehouse key log because he trusted Dax more than paperwork. The log was half digital and half scribbled, and it looked sloppier than it should have. Dax compared times to the missing shipments and saw repeated entries by the same initials. Those initials belonged to a contract yard worker who only handled loading and trash. The worker was named Cale Rydell, early 40s, hired through a staffing agency. Cale had access to the sign racks at night because he swept the yard and locked gates. That alone was not enough. But the timeline kept lining up in ways that felt too clean. Tressa asked for Cale's address, and Renly refused, saying it needed proper process. That is when the tape entered the story, quietly and almost by accident. A retired dispatcher called the sheriff office and said she had saved an odd recording. She said it was not a 911 call, it was a voicemail left on a county line. The voicemail was from a man who sounded calm, describing a warning system with pride. The cassette-style tape was old because the dispatcher kept personal backups in the 90s. She had transferred it to a digital file years later, but still called it a tape out of habit. Tressa brought the audio to Dax because the voice mentioned signs, bolts, and the bypass. Dax listened with headphones and felt his stomach drop within the first minute. The man on the recording said, "Those warnings are the whole thing. They guide them where you want." He talked about reflective angles and placement, like someone explaining a craft. He mentioned using real county panels, because drivers trusted official metal more than wood boards. He said the best trap was one that looked like safety, and he laughed softly after that. Tressa paused the audio and asked if Dax recognized the voice. Dax did not want to guess, but he said it sounded like someone he had heard on yard radios. Renly sometimes used a gravelly voice when he joked, but this was not Renly. Dax asked where the tape came from, and Tressa said it was dated 1998. That date made no sense at first because the bypass was not completed until 2003. Then Dax remembered something. The service road was older, and it used to serve a quarry site. Old county plans showed the area marked as restricted during blasting operations. Back then, there were warning signs, and the public learned to obey them without question. Tressa and Dax went to the county archive room, a basement space that smelled like damp cardboard. They pulled microfilm and dusty maps, and they found a file labeled Quarry Access Control. Inside were notes about repeated trespass incidents and stolen equipment. A line item mentioned Deterrent Signage Program, approved for night visibility. The author name was not Renly. It was a previous supervisor who retired long ago. That supervisor had a son who worked briefly at the county yard, then left under a cloud. Dax found the son's name in an old staffing roster, and it matched Cale Rydell's legal name. Cale had changed his last name later, and the archive file still carried the older one. Tressa ran it up the chain and got a warrant for Cale's phone and storage unit. The unit was across town, behind a row of auto shops, and it looked ordinary from outside. Inside, deputies found stacks of sign blanks, reflective sheeting, and a crate of banding straps. They also found a portable drill press and a set of county serial stamps. Cale did not deny making signs, but he claimed he was building props for a film project. Tressa asked why the props matched the crash locations and why they used county serial formats. Cale shrugged and said people drove too fast, and they would crash anywhere. Then he said something that matched the tape, almost word for word. He said, if they see a warning, they do what the warning says. That line hit the room like a cold slap because it was not a defense. It was a philosophy, and it sounded practiced, like he had repeated it for years. The payoff came when they compared the tape voice to a recorded jail call. The sheriff office had legal access to that call, and a voice analyst reported a strong match. It was not perfect science, but combined with the tools and the signs, it added weight. Tressa also found that Cale's father had been the quarry security contractor in 1998. That meant the tape was likely the father teaching the son, or the son learning early. Either way, it explained how the method existed before the bypass ever did. When the quarry shut down, the service road stayed, and the idea stayed with it. Then the bypass opened, and the trap finally had traffic. The case did not solve every crash with absolute certainty, and nobody promised it would. Some drivers were drunk, some were tired, and some made bad choices with no help from signs. Still, witness statements changed after the arrest because people finally trusted their own memory. Several said they saw a man at night moving calmly with a flashlight near the trees. The county replaced every warning sign on that stretch, using locked hardware and tracked serial scans. They also blocked the service road with boulders and steel posts, leaving only a narrow footpath. Dispatch logs showed a sharp drop in late-night crashes within weeks. The bypass became boring again, which was the best possible outcome. Dax kept a copy of the tape transcript in his work folder, even after the trial ended. He did not listen to it anymore, because the laughter at the end stuck in his head. He only remembered the lesson. Signs were supposed to protect people, not steer them into danger. When he bolted a warning sign to a post, he checked it twice, then checked it again. The stories. What happened inside this roadside diner will shock you. The incident became a training story in 2 counties because the footage looked ordinary until the last minute. It happened at a roadside diner off a long desert highway, and nobody agreed on what they saw. Dorian Kessler was 37 and worked as a commercial refrigeration tech for grocery stores and small restaurants. On a Tuesday in late spring, he drove east through high desert to replace a failing walk-in cooler motor. He had a work order, a parts box, and a plan to be home before dark. The diner was the only open place for miles, so he stopped for coffee first. The building was low and sunburned, with a buzzing sign and a gravel lot full of dust. Inside, the air smelled like fryer oil and lemon cleaner, and the booths stuck to the skin. A waitress named Maris Sloan was on shift, and she looked tired but alert. Maris was 42 and worked nights and mornings because the diner never fully closed. Dorian ordered black coffee and eggs, then checked his phone for the address again. Maris slid the plate down and asked what brought him out so far. He said he fixed coolers, and he was there to keep someone from losing a whole freezer. She nodded like she had heard that story 100 times, then glanced toward the kitchen door. A cook called something he could not make out, and Maris answered without turning around. Dorian noticed a small camcorder behind the register, aimed at the dining room. The diner did not feel dangerous, but it felt watched in a way he could not explain. A man in a windbreaker sat at the counter and kept his hands in his pockets. Two truckers shared a booth, and they spoke low like they did not want attention. Dorian ate fast, then went to pay, because he wanted to start work before heat rose. As he stood at the register, the power flickered once, and the lights dimmed for a second. The buzzing sign outside changed pitch, like the voltage dipped and snapped back. Maris frowned and tapped the register screen. Then the printer spit a blank slip. She sighed and said, "Not again. It did this yesterday, too." Dorian offered to look, because voltage drops were his whole life. Maris led him through the swinging door into the kitchen, and the noise got louder at once. Fans rattled in a vent hood, and an old freezer clicked like a bad relay. The cook was a broad man named Keenan Rourke, and he looked about 50. Keenan said the back hallway light had been pulsing, and the storage cooler was warm. Dorian opened his parts box, then crouched by the breaker panel near the dish area. He checked the main feed with a tester, and the numbers jumped more than they should. The panel cover was newer than the rest of the kitchen, and the screws looked recently handled. Dorian asked when the panel was replaced, and Keenan shrugged without looking at him. Maris said the owner did it after a break-in back in 2019. Dorian noticed her eyes stayed on the hallway that led to the back offices. The hallway was narrow and dark, with a mop bucket halfway blocking the path. A door at the end had a keypad, which felt strange for a place this small. Dorian pointed at it, and Maris said it was the office and storage for payroll. She said the owner did not like people back there, not even staff. Dorian nodded and went back to the panel, but he kept thinking about that keypad. He traced the flicker to a loose neutral and a corroded lug, which was simple and annoying. While he tightened the connection, a muffled thump came from the back hallway. Keenan paused with a pan in his hands, and Maris held her breath for a beat. Dorian asked if someone was in the office, and Maris said, "It is probably the ice maker." The thump came again, and this time it sounded closer, like it was against the hallway wall. Dorian stood and wiped his hands, then said he would check the ice machine anyway. Maris stepped in front of him, and her voice stayed flat as she said no. Keenan kept his eyes down, but his jaw tightened like he was chewing a secret. Dorian took a step back, because the tension felt wrong for a loose wire. He said he would just finish the panel, then leave them to it. The lights steadied after his fix, and the kitchen fans settled into a smoother hum. Maris thanked him too quickly, then walked him back toward the dining room. As they passed the hallway, Dorian saw the keypad light blink, then go dark again. He also saw a thin strip of fresh paint along the doorframe, not matching the older walls. He filed it away as odd, then returned to the register to pay for his breakfast. The windbreaker man at the counter had turned to watch them, and his eyes looked red-rimmed. When Dorian set cash down, the man spoke softly, without turning fully around. He said, "You should not be back there. It is not safe." Dorian asked what he meant, and the man shook his head like he regretted speaking. Maris snapped, "He is leaving, and you are done talking in here." Dorian took his receipt, and the printer finally worked again, as if it waited for him. Outside, the heat hit his face, and the lot looked emptier than before. He walked to his van, and he noticed a second security camera under the eave. It was angled toward the back door, not the customers, which felt deliberate. He started the engine, then hesitated, because the warning from the counter stuck to him. Dorian drove around the building like he meant to find the service entrance for the cooler job. Behind the diner was a fenced area with stacked crates and a rusted shed. He saw the back door, and near it was a fresh set of tire tracks in soft dirt. The tracks were narrow and deep, like a small truck had backed up recently. He also saw a dent in the door, low and wide, like something heavy hit it. He told himself it was none of his business. Then he heard a short burst of sound. It was not a shout, more like a clipped yelp that cut off fast. Dorian killed the engine and listened, and the desert silence made the sound feel louder. He walked toward the fence line, staying near his van, and called out, "Everything okay?" No one answered, but he heard a faint scraping, like a chair dragged across concrete. Dorian pulled his phone and started recording, mostly to prove he was not imagining it. He walked closer to the back door, and he noticed a smell like bleach and warm metal. A small vent near the foundation blew air, and it carried that smell in short puffs. He leaned down and saw the vent screws were new, bright against dirty siding. Then the scraping stopped, and a hush fell so hard it felt staged. The back door opened a crack, and Maris looked out with her face set. She asked what he was doing, and her tone was sharp enough to cut. Dorian said he heard something and wanted to make sure nobody was hurt. Maris said, "You are not helping. You are making it worse." Before he could answer, the windbreaker man appeared behind her in the doorway shadow. The man held one finger to his lips, then pointed down toward the ground near Dorian. Dorian looked and saw a folded napkin stuck under a crate like it had been tossed. Maris did not notice, or pretended not to notice, and she started to close the door. Dorian stepped back and said he was leaving. Then he turned and picked up the napkin fast. He walked to his van without unfolding it, because he did not want them to see. Inside the van, he opened the napkin and found a short message in shaky block letters. It said, "Do not call the diner, call the highway dispatch." Below that, a second line said, "Ask about the tape from 2016. Dorian sat still for a moment, hearing his own breathing over the idling engine. He did not know what highway dispatch meant, but the fear in the handwriting was clear. He drove 2 miles down the road to a wide turnout, then parked behind a broken sign. He called the county non-emergency line, and the operator transferred him to highway dispatch. He told them he was near a diner and had a safety concern, and he asked about a tape. The dispatcher went quiet, then asked for the diner name and the nearest mile marker. Dorian gave what he could, and the dispatcher told him to stay put and keep the line open. Within 10 minutes, 2 highway patrol units rolled in, then a county deputy behind them. Dorian explained everything, including the flicker, the thumps, and the napkin message. He played the short recording from behind the diner, which captured the yelp and scraping. The deputy listened with a blank face, then asked if Dorian had entered the back hallway. Dorian said no, and the deputy nodded like that mattered more than anything else. The patrol sergeant told Dorian he did the right thing, but his tone sounded rehearsed. They asked him to write a statement, and they took the napkin in an evidence bag. Dorian watched them drive back toward the diner, lights off, moving like they wanted surprise. He stayed in his van as instructed, but he could see the diner sign from the turnout. The sign kept buzzing, and each buzz sounded like a warning he could not translate. A half hour later, the deputy called him back on the same number. The deputy said officers were speaking with staff, and there was no immediate threat found. Dorian asked about the message and the tape from 2016, and the deputy paused. He said, "That is old business, and it is not for you." Dorian asked if someone had written the napkin, and the deputy said no one claimed it. Dorian could have left it there, but the whole thing felt like a trap door opening under him. He drove home with his statement copy on the seat, and he did not tell anyone that night. 2 days later, he got a call from an unknown number, and a man spoke without greeting. The man said, "Stop looking. You got lucky, and luck runs out." Dorian asked who it was, but the line went dead before he got another word out. He did not stop looking, but he looked in ways that stayed inside the lines. He filed a public records request for dispatch logs tied to that mile marker and that date. He also searched old local news archives using the diner name and the year from the napkin. What he found was thin and careful, like someone trimmed the story down on purpose. There was a brief mention of a missing drifter, last seen near the highway in 2016. The article described a backpack found in a ditch and a witness who heard arguing near a diner. It did not name staff, and it did not mention any search of the building. Dorian found a second reference in a scanned weekly paper, and it was even shorter. It said the case was unresolved, and the lead detective had transferred out. No follow-up, no closure, and no reason why a random tech would be warned years later. Dorian remembered the camcorder behind the register, and he wondered who controlled that footage. He drove back in daylight on his next week off, choosing a busy lunch hour for cover. The diner looked the same, but a new handwritten sign said cash, only today. Dorian sat in a booth facing the register, and he watched the camera like it might blink. Maris served him without recognition, or she acted like she did not recognize him. A younger server named Lenka Pruitt refilled his coffee, and she seemed nervous in a different way. Lenka was 24 and worked part-time while taking community college classes in a nearby town. Dorian asked if the diner had been busy lately, and Lenka said it depended on who came in. He asked about the camera, and Lenka said the owner watched everything from home. Dorian asked who the owner was, and Lenka said everyone called him Mr. H. She said she never saw his full name on anything. Dorian asked to use the restroom. Then he walked past the hallway like it was an accident. The mop bucket was gone, but the keypad door was still there, clean and freshly painted. He listened with his ear near the wall, and he heard a low humming like a small motor. It was not like an ice machine. It was steadier, like a fan pulling air through a duct. Dorian backed away when Lenka appeared, and she asked if he was lost. He said he was fine. Then he slipped her a folded receipt with his number written on it. He told her to call if she ever felt unsafe, and he kept his voice calm. Lenka stared at the receipt, then tucked it into her apron without a word. Dorian returned to his booth and finished his food, then left cash and walked out. As he crossed the lot, the windbreaker man from before sat in a different car, watching him again. That night, Lenka texted Dorian from a new number, and she used short, careful sentences. She said the owner paid cash under the table and made staff sign weird policy sheets. She said the back office was off limits, and Maris got angry if anyone even joked about it. Lenka said the humming came and went, mostly at night, and the lights sometimes flickered. She also said Keenan never ate in the diner, and he kept his own food in a cooler outside. Dorian asked if Lenka could photograph the policy sheet, and she said she would try. The next day, she sent 2 blurry photos taken in a restroom mirror for privacy. The paper listed rules about phones, cameras, and talking to law enforcement without permission. One line said any contact with outside agencies had to be reported to management immediately. Dorian felt his stomach tighten because diners did not need rules like that. He took the photos to a friend who worked records at the county courthouse named Sutter Hale. Sutter was 45 and handled filing systems, and he knew which requests to avoid. Sutter said the policy sheet looked like something a private security firm might draft. He also said the diner property had changed hands through an LLC, with layers that hid names. Sutter found one older permit tied to a different business, and it mentioned structural ventilation work. The permit date was 2019, matching what Maris had said about the panel. Dorian asked if Sutter could find the contractor name, and Sutter did, after a long pause. The contractor was a small outfit that did industrial ducting for meat processing plants. That did not fit a diner unless someone needed strong airflow for something heavy. Dorian thought about the bleach smell and the fresh vent screws behind the building. He also remembered the tire tracks and the dent in the back door. Dorian went back to the turnout at night, parking where he could see the diner without being seen. He used a cheap directional microphone, the kind wildlife people used for bird calls. He did not point it at windows. He aimed it at the back lot and the vent area. For an hour, he heard normal sounds, trucks on the highway and wind over gravel. Then, near midnight, the humming began, and it rose into a deeper mechanical note. A vehicle backed into the rear lot, and its reverse beep cut through the desert. Dorian saw taillights, low and close together, like a delivery van with a trailer hitch. The back door opened, and 2 figures moved something large on a dolly. The shapes were hidden by shadows, but the dolly wheels squeaked in a steady rhythm. Dorian recorded the sound, then he watched the back door close, and the humming intensified. He did not call the diner, because the napkin message had been clear about that. He called highway dispatch again, and he told them a delivery was happening right now. This time the dispatcher asked if he was the man from last week, and Dorian said yes. The dispatcher said units were already staged, and Dorian felt cold hearing that. Within minutes, dark vehicles rolled off the highway without lights, then stopped behind the diner. Dorian could not see what happened behind the building, but he heard shouting carry across the flat land. He heard one sharp bang, then another, and he could not tell if they were doors or something worse. He heard a woman scream once, then a voice yelled, "On the ground, now!" After that, the sounds turned into radio chatter and short commands that blurred together. The diner sign kept buzzing, and it sounded almost cheerful against the chaos. The next day, local news reported a multi-agency inspection that uncovered code violations and an illegal operation. They did not say what the operation was, only that arrests were made and the property was seized. They showed daytime footage of the diner lot, with evidence tape and workers carrying boxes. They did not show the back hallway, and they did not mention any missing person investigation. Dorian read every article he could find, and none of them explained the humming or the vent work. Lenka texted once more, and her message was short and shaky. She said Maris and Keenan were gone, and nobody could reach them, and staff were told nothing. Lenka said officers asked about an old camcorder tape, and they looked angry when it was missing. She said the windbreaker man was not arrested, but he vanished before questions started. Dorian asked if Lenka was safe, and she said she was leaving town that day. A week later, Dorian got his public records request back, and most of it was denied. One page slipped through, likely by mistake, and it was a dispatch summary from 2016. It mentioned a call from a payphone near the diner, reporting a person locked in a storage room. The call ended abruptly, and officers arrived to find the payphone smashed and the diner closed early. The summary said the responding unit noted a new lock on the back hallway door. It also said the diner owner refused a search, claiming no probable cause. That line matched the keypad door, and it matched the way Maris blocked Dorian in the kitchen. The twist was not a secret tunnel or a monster, it was something more ordinary and uglier. Someone had learned that a diner could hide things in plain sight, using noise and grease as cover. The ventilation work was not for comfort, it was to move air through a space nobody could enter. The humming was not an ice maker, it was a fan system tied to that locked room. Dorian still did not know who wrote the napkin, but he believed the windbreaker man helped. Maybe he had been a witness in 2016, or maybe he had been trapped there too. Dorian also did not know where the missing tape went or what it showed in the last minute. He only knew the diner ran like a stage, and staff were cast into roles they could not quit. When the lights flickered, it was not only a bad wire, it was a warning that something was running. Months later, the building sat empty, and the sign was taken down, leaving a pale outline on the wall. Dorian drove past once and saw weeds pushing through the gravel, reclaiming the lot in slow motion. He thought about how normal the breakfast had tasted and how fast normal turned into threat. He thought about Lenka taking photos in a mirror, trying to help without getting caught. He thought about a payphone call that ended mid-sentence and how silence can be engineered. Dorian kept doing refrigeration work, and he kept his head down because that felt safest. When he stopped at roadside places, he looked for keypad doors and fresh paint on old walls. He listened for steady humming that did not match the size of the building. He never told the story like a hero because he did not feel like one. He just felt lucky that a folded napkin landed where he could see it.